Dear students of grade 12, welcoming you all to this economics class. Today we shall be learning Part B, Indian Economic Development, and under this we shall be dealing on with the chapter 3, that is Economic Reform since 1999 onwards. So you have studied in previous chapter that since independence, India followed a mixed economy system by combining both the capitalist economy as well as the socialist economy. However, some scholars have argued that over the years, this policy has resulted in the establishment of a variety of rules and laws which ultimately aimed at controlling and regulating our Indian economy, and it ended up hampering the process of our growth and development. Therefore, the government has introduced a new set of policy measures after 1991, which changed the direction of our developmental strategies. So, in this chapter, we will be looking at the background on some of the measures that the government has adopted and their impact on various sectors of the economy. So, these are some of the topics that we will be learning from this chapter. In July 1991, India has taken a series of measures to structure the economy as well as to improve the balance of payment crisis. Because during this time, India met with an economic crisis relating to its external debt. That is, our government was not able to make any repayment on its borrowings from abroad, and ultimately this crisis further compounded by rising in the price of the essential commodities. So all this led the government to introduce a new set of policy measures, and this new economic policy introduced a changes in several areas. So this policy started with a very silent features. These features are liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So therefore, this new economic policy or the new economic system is known as LPG policy. Now, let us first learn the meaning of economic reform. The term economic reform broadly indicates a necessary structural adjustment to external events, that is, foreign affairs. It includes the functioning of countries' spending to the level parallel to its income, and thereby reducing fiscal deficit. That means reducing a government deficit. So, in order to make this structural adjustment, this required a gradual reduction in import and increasing our export. India has started its new economic policy in the year 1991, indicating a new plan in action by the government to influence our production and capital formation of the country. Major effect to this new economic policy were done by our former Prime Minister of India, P.V. Narasimha Rao, and Finance Minister of India, Manmohan Singh. These two are the main contributor to this new economic policy during 1991. Now, let us learn how India has started this financial crisis. In the late 1980s, government expenditure began to exceed its revenue by a large margin, and that meeting this expenditure through the borrowing became unsustainable. Consequently, our prices of many essential goods rose sharply. Imports also grew at a very high rate without matching the growth of our export. No country or international funders was willing to lend India. Therefore, during this time, India has approached the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, and they received a $7 billion as loan to manage this crisis. However, for availing this loan, this international agency, that is the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, they expected India to bring some changes in their economy by removing restriction on the private sector and reducing the role of the government in many areas. That is why India agreed to this condition of the World Bank and IMF, and they announced this new economic policy in the year 1991. We shall be learning now why India needed for economic reform, or the reason for implementing this new economic policy. So there are various reasons why we need this economic reform. The first reason is due to mounting fiscal deficit. So the fiscal deficit, it means the government deficit had been increasing year after year on a continuous increase in non-development expenditure. So due to this, there was a rise in the public debt, which led to a debt trap situation. So ultimately, it became essential for the government to restore our fiscal discipline in the economy. The second reason is due to adverse balance of payment. It implies that despite a restrictive policy adopted by the government till 1990, our export could not compete in terms of the price and quality in the international market. As a result, there was a slow growth in our export uh, and rapid increase in import. So accordingly, this burden leads to our government to adopt this economic reform. The third reason is due to Gulf crisis. During the time in the year 1990 to 91, on account of the Iraq war, the prices of the petrol shot up. Ultimately, this affects our country's economy, and due to this, we were needing an economic reform. Another reason is again due to poor performance of PSUs, that is public sector undertakings. Public sector undertakings are those sectors where the government took the ownership in terms of enterprises or in terms of industry. So, due to the poor performance of the public sector undertakings, um, there was an incurring loss in they occur an incurring loss, and their performance was not satisfactory. So on account of this factor, it became imperative for the government to adopt a new economic policy. uh, Another reason again is due to rise in the price. In the year 1991 or prior to that year, there was a huge rise in the price of food grains and essential commodities, which depends our economic crisis from bad to worse. So this is also another reason, and the last reason is due to a fall in foreign exchange. Now, for what do you mean by foreign exchange reserve? Foreign exchange reserve is an asset which held as a reserve by the central bank in the foreign currency. So in 1990 to 1991, our Indian foreign exchange reserve fell to such a low level that there was not enough to pay for an import bill. So in such a situation, the government had to helplessly restore its policy for liberalization as suggested by the World Bank. So these are the various reasons why we need the economic reform or new economic policy in the year 1991. We have learned earlier that some of the main features of economic reform are uh, liberalization, privatization, and globalization, which we call it LPG policy. So we shall be learning now each of these features in detail. Students, we shall be learning the first features under this economic reform, that is liberalization. Liberalization implies free from direct or physical control by the government in the way of trade. This liberalization was introduced in order to put an end to the government restriction and open up an opportunities in various sectors of the economy. Now, before 1991, there were some controls made by the government in many areas. These are industrial licensing system was a rigid process. Government were controlling the prices of the commodities and goods. Import licensing were also under in the hand of the government. Restriction on investment was also made by the government. So ultimately, there were reform were needed under this liberalization. Some of the main four reform took place under this liberalization are industrial reform, financial reform, fiscal reform, and external reform. Now, what does this industrial reform implies? Industrial reform implies a removal of this restriction made by the government in industrial sector. After 1991, industrial licensing was abolished for almost all the product. and that the only industries which are now reserved for the public sector are defense equipments, atomic energy generation, and railway transport. In many of these industries, the market has now been allowed to determine the prices. Second is financial sector reform. This implies a reform in the financial institutions such as commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange operation, and foreign exchange market. One of the major aims of sector reforms is to reduce the role of RBI from regulator to facilitator of the financial sector. This means that the financial sector may be allowed to take decision on many matters without consulting the RBI. Tax reforms are concerned with the reforms in the government taxation and public expenditure policies. Foreign exchange reforms is a reform took place in the foreign affairs. The first important reform in the external um, sector was made in the foreign exchange market in 1991 as an immediate measure to resolve the balance of payment crisis. The rupee was devaluated against the foreign currencies. Now, what does this devaluated or devaluation means? A devaluation implies a reduction in our official value of currency in relation to the other currency. Now, due to this devaluation, there was an increase in the inflow of foreign exchange, and that foreign countries can now buy the Indian goods. This can provide a good inflow to our Indian export. The second features under economic reform is privatization. Privatization is defined as the transfer of function, activity, or organization from the public sector to private sector. Now, there can be two ways for privatization. The first is by selling of the public sector units to private sector, and the second ways is by withdrawing of public sector units to the joint sector. Now, some of the objective of this privatization is to increase the efficiency and competitive power of the enterprises, to strengthen the industrial management, to earn more and more of foreign currency, to make the optimum use of our resources, and to achieve a rapid industrial development in our country. The third features under economic reform is globalization. These features you might have already learned in class 10. So, globalization implies integration of the economy of the country with the world economy. Now, this globalization is defined as the process of associating with increasing openness, growing our economic independence, and deepening economic integration with the rest of the world or the world economy. One of the major steps taken under globalization is establishing an outsourcing system. Now, what is this outsourcing? Outsourcing it is a system of hiring business services from the outside world. Now, this outsourcing has many advantages. Uh, some of the advantages of outsourcing are easy availability of cheap labor, reasonable degree of skill, cheap and abundant availability of raw material, and revolutionary growth of IT industry in India. So there are many positive effects brought by this new economic policy. The first is it has increased in the growth rate of our GDP, gross domestic product. The IT industry has also achieved a global recognition. It increases our government revenue, which ultimately increases our national income. It also increases in foreign exchange reserve. Flow of the private and foreign investment started to increase. Recognition of India as an emerging power um, by the other country. Shift from monopoly market to competitive market. Monopoly market means a single market to a competitive market. And through this new economic policy, they also declined poverty. However, there are also some negative effect and impact brought by this new economic policy. These are they neglected the agriculture sector. They concentrate more on urban growth rather than the rural. Preference for the handicrafts was also limited and low. Cultural erosion was there in our country. This new economic is like economic colonization. Students, when we are learning this chapter 3, economic reform since 1991, we shall be learning uh, a recent reform took place in the Indian economy, that is demonetization. So demonetization is a process of stripping a currency unit of its status as a legal tender. In simple words, the demonetized notes are no longer valid as legal currency. Usually, a new currency is replaced by the old currency unit. In November 8, 2006, Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced this demonetization of rupees 500 and rupees 1000 currency notes. Furthermore, the government gave 2 months to deposit this demonetized money in any bank. 2016 is not the first instance of demonetization in India. In fact, demonetization happened in India even before 2016. According to the source, in 1946, the Reserve Bank of India had demonetized rupees 1000 and rupees 10,000 currency notes. Following in 1954, the government introduced a new currency notes of rupees 1000, rupees 5000 and rupees 10,000. In 1978, the Morarji Desai, who is the then Prime Minister of India, under his government, they demonetized rupees 1000, rupees 5000, and rupees 10,000 notes in order to curb illegal transactions and anti-social activities. So, some of the objectives of demonetization in 2016 are to block out financing to terrorists, to help unearth the black money. So, this unearthed black money will expand or increase the finances of the government, that is, a fiscal space of the government, to help reduce interest rates in the banking system, and it also aimed to help formalize the India's informal economy. So this would reduce the extent of cash transaction and help in the creation of less cash economy. The benefits of demonetization are it increases saving, it also lowers the lending rates, it improves a better economy, it curbs antisocial and illegal activities, it also reduces a counterfeit currency note, that is, it reduces a fake notes. So these are some of the benefits of demonetization. Another major reform took place recently in our economy is the introduction of GST, that is goods and service tax. Now, this goods and service tax has replaced many indirect tax in India, such as excise duty, VAT, service tax, etc. Now, what is this excise duty? Excise duties are tax imposed on manufacture of goods. VAT is normally called a consumption tax. In India, Indian government usually imposes VAT on the sale of goods and services. So all these indirect tax has now replaced uh, duties GST. The Goods and Service Tax Act was passed in the Parliament on 29 March 2017, and it came into effect on 1st July 2017 onwards. So these are some of the important in list of the indirect tax before the GST, that is pre-GST regime. So these are some of the tax that was imposed. I hope you'll be able to learn through this slide. So all these, that is central GST, state GST, have replaced all of the above taxes. So, in conclusion, I would like to point out that the process of globalization through liberalization and these privatization policies has produced a positive as well as a negative result both for India and other countries. Some scholars have argued that this globalization should be seen as an opportunity in terms of greater access to global markets, high technology, and increased possibility of large industries for developing countries in order to become an important players in the international arena. So these are some of the topics which you have learned under this chapter. I hope you have learned something on this chapter. I want you all to keep in mind the recent two major reform took place, that is demonetization and GST under this chapter, because usually those questions used to ask in the exam. So we shall be learning the next chapter, the next unit in the next class. So until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and study well. Thank you.